Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the Network Automagic Show, Episode 2. I'm Steinsy, and I'm joined by my trusty cohorts, Urs. And on today's episode, we have a special guest, all the way from OpsMill, Infrahub, founder, chief something. I didn't even read the titles before this thing started. Slayer of Netbox, supposedly. Creator of the Network Source of Truth 2.0, allegedly. Damien, and I can't pronounce that last name because I'm pretending to be an American and not a European. Damien, tell the listener a little bit about yourself.
Hey, thanks for having me. Hi, Steinsy. Hi, Horst. So Damien Garros, I'm co-founder and CEO of OpsMill. We're trying to make some fun, bring some fun in the infrastructure automation space. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't put that as definitely not trying to destroy Netbox, but more I think to bring more innovation in this space. I think that sounds more fun to me. A little bit about me. I've been doing networking started in networking. Very quickly found automation as something very fascinating that could actually expand, I think, what we could do in networking. So I've been doing that for close to 15 years now. Been doing that in different places. I've been at different vendors. I've been on the customer side. And I think very quickly for me, it was very clear that more than an automation problem, we have a data problem. And automation is all about data. And, very quickly, I started looking into source of truth, the intent. I also spend a lot of time doing observability. Actually, those are really my two passions. And I think it gets even more excited when you start coupling the source of truth with the observability. And I think about 7 years ago, I actually had the opportunity to go more into the observability space. And I looked at it, was like, no, I think there's no fun doing more observability until we have a better source of truth. So I was like, okay, I'm going to put my focus on that. And I've been using Netbox for 7 years now, even more. I was part of the team that started Nonobot when I was at Network to Code. And I still felt like that was not good enough. So I decided to start from scratch, completely from scratch, and we can talk about it. And then we started Infrahub.
That sounds like a pretty good intro. That's very podcast worthy. I should actually step down. We're going to actually have Damien host the show from now on because he actually sounds like he knows what he's doing. So for the listener, if you haven't been catched up on the latest and greatest meta trend of, network automation hype bubble, the too long didn't read story is a long time ago, Netbox was founded. Today, Netbox is kind of becoming the Xerox of the space, which means they're very big, they're very powerful. They're, if they don't fall asleep at the wheel, they are going to kick some ass, right? But the problem with Xerox is they start to move a little bit slower, and then the new kid on the block shows up, and this happened with floppy disks and CDs, right? This happened with Kodak. This is a story that's old as time. The question is, are they going to get themselves, get the ship back on track, fix their certain plugin problems? The ecosystem is a little bit, it's as someone who loves Netbox, I use it in production. I am a very happy user of Netbox, but it is sometimes a death by a thousand cuts situation where you find out that you can't filter a Boolean on null because a Boolean has 3 states, as we know. It's true, false, and null when it hasn't been set. And sometimes the filtering doesn't work. Sometimes the Icelandic characters don't work. That is a pet peeve of mine. I can't search for emojis. So whenever you have strange addresses like Eyjafjallavatnajökull or some weird thing with a lot of Icelandic characters, I have spaces in some of my addresses, and that is not great most of the time. So where we stand right now is that Damien actually has some background, and he was involved with Netbox. He was also involved with Autobot, very interesting project. It's not Netbox, so I like original Coke. I don't drink Pepsi, but Infrahub appears to not be a Pepsi or Coke situation. It appears to be a Red Bull situation, and Red Bull can be sold very independently of Coke. Now, that should get you catched up on pretty much the meta right now, that pretty much everyone and their dog is using Netbox. There's a lot of Autobot users as well. And there is a growing section of Infrahub users, and especially people poking around and playing with it, yours truly included. Now, I've been authorized at my particular day job to investigate Infrahub and see how it can help us. Do we want to push data directly into ServiceNow? Do we want to go the CMDB route? Do we want to do the custom Postgres, sitting in the corner, which we used to do back in the day, and have a bunch of relations, and then it's kind of a database migration nightmare to make changes? Or do we want to get something fresh, new, out of the box that we just configure some YAML files and I get whatever I want, basically? Is that what you're offering me?
Yeah, maybe if you don't mind me actually taking maybe one step back, because just like why we need something different, I
Mhm.
think that could be and maybe to get back to the what's the issue is the current situation again. And to be fair, I know you want to make it like there's a lot of fights between Netbox and all of that, but actually I do really
They're all
respect what
friends. I've seen you hugging at the conferences. They're all in love with each other.
I think to be fair, like Netbox has been a huge disruption in the industry. They brought this incredible idea that as you put IPAM and DCIM and all those data together, and I think they
Mhm,
really make a lot of people, including me, how important it is to have all this data properly figured out and in the same place, and how important it is to automate. To that, huge kudos to Netbox.
mhm.
Now, I think the main issue is, and that's what I started to realize pretty quickly after using it, and I've seen a lot of people is it's it's you need to be able to store a lot of information in this system. And while when you look at the technical data, you will mostly have the same. As soon as you start wanting to put business data and or you have a little bit of exotic things, then you start hitting the limitation having an application has a fixed data model. And to be honest, it's most applications have been built this way, and so one of the biggest challenge I think is building the solution is we need to find a way to provide a tool that let the user extend the data model. And to be fair, it's a huge problem. And it's not something like actually, there's no application that can really do that today. Um, and I think the issue is it's really after working on Netbox and Autobot for so long, I came to the realization that the technical stack is the main issue. It's like Netbox and Autobot, they're using Django. Django is an amazing framework. It's such a popular framework. So you can build apps really, really fast. But it was never meant to let the end user change the data model. Like Django was designed so that the developers of the application can define a data model, make it static, and then ship it to the user, and he already off you go. But like that's not how Django was designed. And so when I started actually realizing that after working on Notebot, and we are trying to make it more extensible, and we added these features that I really loved. That was called the custom relationships, where customers could create their own relationship between the object, and we saw some amazing stuff with that. But then I realized we were just like twisting Django arms every step of the way, and we started running into performance issue and all of that. It's just like I was like, okay, we got to start fresh, and that's really um, where we started with Infrahub. And the other part was version control. I think we tend to forget in our space, like we're in networking, we're so focused on what we do, we forget that all the guys in clouds and all of that, they've been using Git as their source of truth for most of their source of truth is actually in Git. In my perspective, they're using Git because it has a very flexible data model. They don't have the restrictions of a Django app, and yeah, and because they fucking love version control, and it's becoming so critical and important of everything we do nowadays in infrastructure management. So bringing that to me was amazing. Was
That
the one of the really big piece that why we started building InfraHub.
that actually really answers in a very fair manner the why of InfraHub, right? It's the immutability. Again, speaking like it, no, it doesn't sound like it, but I actually love Napbox, and I'll give it up kicking and screaming. I personally, the idea of moving all my stuff from Napbox, especially in a production environment, to something new and fancy, I love new and fancy as well, right? But I have a lot of custom integrations. I have a billing team that's talking directly to Netbox. I have this and that that's talking to Netbox. I'll have to either go talk to the billing team and tell them, hey, I've made a wrapper API on the same location. So you'll get the same data out of Infrahub. Don't worry about it. Or I'll have to tell them to go rewrite their billing code. And if you ever talk to anyone who's related to billing in any way, they'll get very mad at you. Like, what? It's only been 10 years. Like, this is new. Why are you swapping this out today? Like that stuff, Navision and SAP, that sort of thing, that stuff, runs for decades inside of a business, right? As long as you don't go out of business. What I want to know is, if let's say that I go on this crazy journey with the cool kids at Infrahub, right? And you already offer some migration paths or a hybrid model, do you not?
Yeah, we do. So yeah, so there's this tool that we call Infrahub Sync. I think the fundamental is that by definition, there's no single source of truth. Like there's been this talk in the industry that we're gonna have a single system to rule them all and all that. I don't think that's realistic. At the end of the day, there's always gonna be a lot of tools that have data. There's always gonna be ServiceNow. There's always gonna be tools that have more business informations or critical things. So we really wanted in this approach with Infrahub to embrace the fact that we're going to have to synchronize data between different systems. And I think that's what you're referring to is like customers that are actually coming from Netbox, they really leverage that as a way to say, okay, I have my Netbox, it's still being used as a read-only, like the goal is to have it more as a read-only system for the rest of the organization, for example, and then they can sync that data into Infrahub using Infrahub Sync. So it's a framework that we built, it's like a separate tool on the side, actually very related to the first episode of the podcast because we're using Daxter that you talked a lot about you guys talked a lot about in the first episode, and so we're using that to actually synchronize how we can sync data between different systems. So yeah, definitely super helpful. I think what's also really cool, there's something we don't talk a lot about in this space is the importance of not just synchronizing the data, but also keeping track of the metadata. And like, I know it's actually something you got a chance to look at, Stancy, but this idea, because in previous life, I was working on Notobot, and we had this tool called SSOT. I was actually part of the team that built that. That was doing kind of the same, like moving data between Notobot and other systems. And what I realized is, as soon as you start moving data, the first thing you realize is you don't want people to, if let's say Infrahub is not the authoritative system for that data, you don't want people to touch it. In some cases, you just want people to be able to consume it, to read it, but you don't want people to touch. So it becomes a very access control problem that sometimes needs a level of granularity that is not easy to achieve. And the second one is people don't know where the data is coming from. When you actually look at a system, it becomes very confusing. Like, why cannot I cannot change this data? Where is it coming from? Where do I need to go if I want to change that? So what is the origin of that data? And all of that is actually part of the metadata. And so it's something that we don't, I haven't heard anybody talking about that in the networking industry. But it's funny because if you look at other industry, there's actually an entire industry that was built around metadata for data. And because the people that are actually building BI and the modern data stack, as they call that nowadays, they had the exact same problem. Like they were moving data all around, they were transforming data, they were doing all of that. And at some point, there's an executive looking at a dashboard that could not understand how good or where the data was coming from and all of that. And so they started figuring out that more than just moving the data, we need to move the data and all of its metadata and lineage information. So I think it's, again, probably could do a dedicated podcast on that. But we also try to integrate that into Infrahub. So
I definitely agree on the problem that we have multiple sources of truth, and that's a huge problem, especially if you want to sync in different ways. So let's say I have a CMDB old style tool for my physical layer, and there is the source of truth of my device names. So how would I now sync that with Infrahub, make sure that no one changes the the device name in Infrahub and goes to the right place to change it. How do you do that?
Yeah, very cool. So you could use Infrahub Sync to actually it's a tool that we built that you still need to write a little bit of code to talk to the remote API. So I assume your tool has at least an API. If not, I guess we could go and talk straight to the database, but I want to believe you have an API, otherwise I would be disappointed. And so you will have to write a little bit of code. And actually the tool really helps to do the synchronization, understand what needs to be created, what's already in Infrahub, all of that. And then when we move the data to Infrahub, we'll be able to automatically set the origin of the data. And we'll also be able to set a flag that say, I want this data to be protected so that nobody can touch it. And when you actually look it in Infrahub, you will see there's a lock on it, and you will not be able to change it. And you will be able to see, okay, oh, this, and that all of that, it actually works at the attributes level. Like it doesn't work at the entire object level. Like you can do that attributes per attribute. So for example, on device, you could lock the name, but you could have another field that is not restricted. And you could have different source for different attributes or on a given object.
That's a really powerful feature. Now, I had this problem the other day, actually. I'm syncing directly from Ivec via Daxter, and then somebody came up to me and asked, hey, Steiny, I want to rename this device. Do I have to go and touch it in Netbox? And, because that particular person had access to the edit functionality inside of Netbox, which I don't give to anyone, because they're not supposed to touch it there directly. Yeah, this would actually solve the problem of, oh, there's a lock icon on it. That means it's Automagic. It's coming in from somewhere else. Now, like you say about data lineage and that sort of thing, being able to actually reference, hey, here's like one of the cool things about Daxter is their data lineage tooling. So like from a database, like you got this table, and you got this, you did some computation, and then you got that table, and finally you have this, and you can see where it came from through the entire process. Like being able to, again, yeah, there's a lot of buzzwords you're going to hear on this episode, and I apologize for that, like artifact stores when it comes to computed attributes and that sort of thing. So, like we're going to have to talk about the attribute store in a little bit, but would it be able, right now I'm doing tags to say, hey, the system of record that's on a per object level, but you're saying that I can actually start disabling inside of Infrahub on the name field inside of that object. Would it be possible for me to have multiple? And here I'm trying to bait you for the inheritance and generics model. I'm baiting you. I'm sorry, listener. I had this all planned out. Let's say that I have a type of firewall, and then that inherits from maybe a type device, but it also gets new attributes, and maybe some of them are locked. Is that something I'll be able to do with Infrahub?
Yes, 100%. Actually, the locking is not even per. So there's so much to unpack on what you just said. But I love it. Let's do it. So first, like the locking, it's actually not even at the schema level, meaning you're not locking all the attributes for a given object. It's really on the object per object basis. And just a teaser, but maybe we could
an instance, object instance,
yes,
an instance
yes.
by instance basis. Yeah.
And one of the reasons why we can do that is because the data is actually stored in a graph database. And so we are not limited by this notion of tables where every object, like I think, it's also why we're not seeing those kind of features on traditional relational database system. But again, maybe something we can dive a bit later. Now, to get back to what you're saying, the generic, I love it. So what you're referring, if I understand, and please tell me if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, but one of the issues I think we have today with traditional sources of truth is that the schema that we have is too generic. Meaning we have, and it comes from the fact that it's not enough flexible because we have to ship something for so many use cases, we end up making a schema very generic. And so we have a device, and a device is a firewall, a device is a patch panel, a device is a network device. And the truth is, all of those systems actually have very different attributes and properties. So what we end up having is all of them are optional. And then we kind of lose the benefit of having a schema. And what we did in Infrahub, it's actually, I'll be honest, it's the features that I didn't realize how critical it was going to be when we implemented that. And it's only after starting using it that I was like, oh my God, that's actually a game changer. So what we have is we have this concept of a polymorphism. You know, it's hard to explain, it's hard to spell, but what it does is this concept of like we have a generic device that has maybe just a minimum number of attributes, like a name and things like that.
A parent,
and then we can
if you
have,
will, a parent. Yeah.
And maybe a parents, maybe a locations, maybe things like that. And then we can have.
So like that, yeah. So like just, you know, because our users are network engineers, polymorphism, it's usually just about inheritance. So when he uses the type of an attribute of the base class, think of that as the parent. So there's a mom and a dad class. So let's just say there's just a mom class with the minimum attributes that can have a baby, and that is the derived one. And the baby can have more stuff on it, right?
Yeah, the best example I think we're using is interfaces. Like we could have a base interface, and then you could have a layer 2 interface that has VLAN information, and you could have a layer 3 interface that has IP information. But they're all interfaces. So from a device point of view, a firewall point of view, you can still have a single relationship to your interfaces. And you don't necessarily, from the device standpoint, have to know how many types of interfaces you have. And if tomorrow you want to add a new, you know, L2 and L3 interface or RB interface or loopback interface, you can just do that on that part of the schema, and it doesn't impact the rest of the, like, everybody doesn't have to understand the when the schema evolve based on those, like we call generic. And I think it's actually why it's so important is it makes it easier to enhance the schema. Where previously in a relational database, if you start creating a new layer 3 interface, you'll have to create a new table, and then you'll have to update the device objects for it to actually know that now there's also layer 3 interface tables and all that. So it just make a big mess in your schema. Using those generic, it just makes it so much easier and extensible. And now we can have like very strict schema for each object. We don't have to add additional logic to validate if, you know, the name is mandatory or if the having an IP address is mandatory on a layer 3 interface and so on.
That's actually, you know, one of the first things that I did. I've been unboxing this thing for the past 2 or 3 weeks now. And just, you know, for the listeners sitting in the car, hello, Olaver. I know you're listening. I just like to say hello to my boss every now and then. He makes sure that I don't say anything bad on this show. But for the example that comes to my mind that's very simple is you have a firewall, right? A concept of a firewall. Great. Okay, now we take that concept of an old firewall box, and the year is 2010, and now we have a VM firewall. A VM firewall is very similar to a physical firewall. That's great. Now we have a virtual context, a slice of that firewall. So let's say that you have 5 customers, and they all get a small virtual, let's do the Fortinet example because Fortinet. You have a VDOM, right? VDOM is just a slice of that firewall that has interfaces. It has most of the components of a normal firewall, which has the most of the components of a normal device, but one of the examples I like to use now is the serial number. It makes sense for the main firewall object, the main device that hosts these virtual VDOMs, to have the serial number on it. It doesn't make any sense for the VDOMs themselves to have a serial number directly on them. Like, that's extra data, and that's confusion inside of the database when it comes to updating, you know, what belongs to the actual main firewall and what belongs to the virtual slice. And that means that I can actually derive from this new object that I create, that I just, you know, did in 20 minutes, that was the VDOM object, and it inherited from devices. And then that means it gets interfaces, that means it gets this, that, and the other. But I can also avoid giving it the serial number if I want to. And then I can also give it other attributes like number of licenses that have been applied to that thing. And this lets me model my business context, which is, hey, you get this many VPN users. I can actually put that on the VDOM, which I'm selling to the customer. And that really blends together stuff that used to be in either a Postgres database or inside of ServiceNow or somewhere where I assigned the number of client VPN licenses to a particular firewall instance. Now I have this beautiful chain of objects that all relate to one another, and I don't have to go updating in multiple locations. So when I change something, I know that I have one field. This is the number of VPN licenses, and I don't have to go through multiple objects or go through a tree of them. And the way that we were implementing this inside a Netbox was unfortunately adding a custom field to the main device type. And that's kind of the beauty of Netbox and how much work has been put into their generic model is that it kind of fits everything. But when you start adding your custom fields, now I have switches that have this field set to 0 or null. And it makes no sense when you're pulling the data. You have a lot of clutter in your data that, layer 3 switches don't have VPN clients, at least, not the ones that I buy. And that means that any changes I make to the main device thing gets added to all my other devices. Versus here, I'm actually able to make this beautiful custom thing. And maybe that sort of brings us along to config generation and the artifacts. See, listener, what I did there, I took you on a little journey. And now we're going to go to what are the artifacts? And because we're going to be able to automate based on these custom values we created. What does this open up, Damien? And he's muted, so he's saying something very smart right now.
I'm that guy. So artifacts, so important. So what we do in Infrahub is we ended up, the goal is to, we believe that, for example, generating the config, I think previously we've been doing it outside of the source of truth. We were using like Ansible or Nornir or any other tools outside. And then we'll generate the config. And for me, there's multiple issues with that. So maybe let's talk about, if you're okay with that, about the issue, and then can talk about how we try to take a different approach with Infrahub. But the first one is generating the config outside. First, I think it sucks. Like, actually, something I love Ansible. I actually really think it's a great tool. I know a lot of people are pretty harsh on it, but I think it's an amazing tool. But let's be honest, like developing Jinja template on Ansible sucks. Troubleshooting Jinja template on Ansible sucks. Like it's just something really hard. So I think the development process isn't great. I think it's great at deploying stuff, making actions. Again, I love Ansible, but not for developing complex Jinja template. The second one is we want the database to be immutable, and in our case. So maybe if we go back to the problem is usually people change their data in their source of truth. They do all of that. And they actually have no visibility on what's going to be the impact of that change on their final config, because the generation is happening on a separate tool, which I think is wrong. Like if you actually, like in Infrahub, because we support version control, we implemented a full CI pipeline and a peer review process to make sure that people can actually review a change before it. But what value does it have if you cannot see the impact on your final config? Like we wanted actually to have the final config being completely part of this review process, so it had to happen inside the system and the source of truth. But the biggest issue, in my perspective, is today we're building those automation stack, and we talked about earlier about how important it is to have a flexible schema, because every time there's a new service, every time there's something, you need to update the schema. You need to add a new custom field, or again, if you're using a traditional solution. And the issue is today, because there's so many tools that are actually pulling data straight from the API that are so tightly coupled with your internal schema that you cannot change the schema. You cannot even add a custom field or rename a custom field, because if you do that, everything is going to break outside. So we end up having those very kind of distributed monoliths. I don't know if that even makes sense to say that, but it's like those systems that becomes impossible to update because everything is tightly coupled to the internal schema. And our approach to that was to say we need to move the boundaries between those systems. Like everything that is super tightly coupled to the internal schema of the database should live very close to the database. And then we just need to expose to the rest of the stack the artifacts. So an artifact for us is a config that you prepared. It's maybe a JSON payload that you're going to feed into an API. It's, I don't know, Terraform config files, or anything you need to actually make the deployments, or that you need to consume from other systems, but that doesn't need to actually understand the internal of the schema and all of that. And so changing that boundary, I think, really helps simplify how much the different components are coupled with each other, and it makes it much easier to actually change the schema of your source of truth.
So you abstract kind of all the complexity. You make it easier for changing. And if I understood correctly, I can compare it with a Git diff maybe. So after I did some changes, I can now make a difference between what changed in the artifact, or
Oh yeah, 100%.
I
100%.
assume that.
So we have this pipeline. So, the typical workflow that we recommend, and again, it's not mandatory, it's more a recommendation, is create a branch, make your change on your data. And so we actually have a system internally. It's also something that's another issue that I think we have with traditional system or even with infrastructure as code, is that usually it's very hard to understand what has changed. And so usually we end up testing everything. We end up regenerating all the config. Like if you're managing a network that has hundreds and hundreds of devices, I've seen systems that are taking hours just to shut down an interface, because just to shut down an interface on one device, you end up testing 500 devices, and you're going to check all of them to make sure that there's no divergence. And I think it comes from the fact that a lot of those systems, they don't actually track the changes. They just have a workflow that has no understanding of what's happening inside. So what we did with Infrahub is, because we want to have all the data in the database, we actually are tracking very precisely which object in the database is used to generate which configuration. And so when one of those objects change, we know exactly which configuration needs to be updated, needs to be regenerated, needs to be tested, in a way that makes the whole pipeline, I think, much faster and much better in many ways. And so we also have it's actually my favorite features, and I don't think we have a lot of people using it today, but we actually developed a unit test frameworks for our artifacts. I don't know, Stanley, if you got a chance to look at that. It's really cool.
It's on my list.
So you can actually write Python tests to validate and help with the generations and the qualifications of your Jinja template. And we will run, like, you can run them locally, you can run them anywhere you want, because we're just using PyTest. But we're also going to run them ourselves in our pipeline if we detect that there's been a change on, the Jinja template or anything that could influence that file. We're going to regenerate and run the test for you and tell you, hey, something is broken in this branch. Probably you should not merge it. You need to fix that before actually moving forward.
So that kind of brings me back to, the artifact generation. You mentioned Jinja 2. So for our listeners who aren't familiar, it's a templating language, very popular. It's, it's a goodie, oldie. It can be kind of a nightmare sometimes to debug, as you said, especially inside of Ansible and running the pipeline again and again in the middle of the night. But when it comes to the artifact, if let's say that we have a network device object inside of Infrahub that we've modeled and it has some attributes, and we have this Jinja template, am I restricted to? And again, here I'm trying to bait you into the computed attributes and the workers in the background. So could I perhaps both use Jinja? Is that easier as a workflow, or could I maybe just write my own custom Python code that maybe reaches out to ServiceNow and gets a change request number and then applies the thing? Every time that I change a value on the device field, this switch that we have in the corner, like I'm going to add a VLAN. I want the config to be updated with the latest change ticket number that was auto-generated when I merged into main, basically.
Yeah, you can definitely. So all of that, we call that the transformation layer, because for us, it's like taking the data that we have inside and exposing it in a different format. And so I think templating and Jinja is just one form of transformation. So we support that. But we also support Python, because honestly, like if your goal is to generate a JSON payload to send to an API or to send to something, you don't want to generate that with Jinja. That would suck. I did it in my days and I was dumb and I was stupid. And it really sucked. But so, yeah, nowadays you definitely want to use Python for it. So we do support Python. To generate, we actually support Python in a lot of different places. Like we support Python to generate the artifact, as you mentioned. We support also Python, for example, for webhooks, if you want to change the payload of those webhooks. And we also support Python for these features that you mentioned, computed attributes. So we have this ability where you can, instead of having people love to use that, for example, for interface description. If you want to codify how your interface, the description of your interface, it should look like. If you want to add the circuit ID and the name of the vendors and the name of the peers, and you want this information to be always right, you don't want to do it manually, and so you can write some either Jinja or Python to actually auto-generate those automatically. So that's a cool feature we added recently.
That's kind of that's kind of one of the main power features compared to, so like we've had stuff like this inside a Netbox, but usually we have a script running on top that does the calculation and creates the object. Here we're actually able to do this natively. Once the object is created, then compute the field. So that means that I get rid of, in theory at least, I get rid of that top script layer that has to handle the UI for selecting the dropdown and all that stuff. And I'm actually able to just, either use the native Infrahub UI, or when I'm pushing stuff via API. So if I'm using a Streamlit app, Streamlit is what the hip cool kids are using these days that love their Python and hate npm install JavaScript framework of death. So if I can, put some sort of on top, I can either do it directly via API, and then I know that every single time, no matter how I generate the object via Streamlit through an API, direct API, or through the actual user interface, I know that the computed description, for example, on that interface is going to get calculated the same way without me having to double up my code all over the place. So that's a very powerful feature. But this kind of comes back to the asynchronicity of the situation. So let's say that, for the listener, Infrahub is really based around branching. So, you have your main branch similar to the Git repo. So it's very, if you're not familiar with GitHub and Git and all that stuff, don't worry. Just think of that as your main config, right? And then you have your proposed change config. That's the branch, right? So in that branch, I can have that description calculated if it's a unique value. And this is kind of, the one thing that started to really, I started to worry about as soon as I saw Infrahub. I was like, oh boy, if I'm allocating IP prefixes, do I allocate them inside of a branch, or do I allocate them once they go into main? And at that point, I get something from the pool. So what are your thoughts, when it comes to resource allocation? Like I believe I can do both, right? I couldn't allocate inside of the branch and then just fail the merge if if I have two branches and they start to go or do they keep an eye on each other?
I love this one. So actually, I love Git, and I think what you mentioned is actually one of the limitations of Git. Is like in Git, branches are completely isolated, and you only really see them coming together when you merge. Here, what we did in Infrahub is we wanted to implement version control, but we didn't do it using Git. We actually implemented that on top of the database. So we have this ability that some things are actually working across branches. And in our case, what we did is we have in Infrahub what we call the resource manager, because we think it's super important when you automate to allocate resources automatically. So resources today, we support IP, we support prefixes, we support any numbers that would be used like to allocate, for example, VLAN ID. But in the futures, we want to be able to manage anything. Could be a resource, a group of interfaces. It could be anything. And so this resource manager, it's designed in a way that it actually is going to understand that you're already using a resource in a branch. And if you're using the resource manager to allocate a resource in a branch, or in two different branches, it will not allocate the same resource, and it will make sure that you will not have the conflict when you actually merge into main. So that's something that I'm really, really happy that we're able to implement that, because I think it really solved one of these issues, version control. That I love version control, but that was one of the things that was annoying to me.
Yeah, that is definitely one of my favorite features of you have, because it was always a huge pain to have this separate database with the primary key for the VLAN and all this stuff, and it's just messy. And out of the box, be able to get the next ASN, the next VLAN ID, the next tunnel interface number. That's definitely one of the. It looks like a small feature, but for me, that's one of the game changers.
Yeah, I agree.
And the fact
and
that
maybe
you're... Go ahead.
No, sorry, because I think I think people are used to, again, if we keep referring Netbox at this point, let's promote Netbox. But in Netbox, they are good guys. There's those APIs that people have been really leveraging that give you like the next IP or the next prefix. But technically, as far as I know, again, maybe but when you do that, you get the information, but it technically does not allocate that IP. You still have to take that, and you still have to actually create the object or create that specific IP and all of that yourself. So with Infrahub, we try to push that even further and to have the IP allocation completely embedded into the object creation. Like you don't even need to make a previous call that say, hey, what is the current IP or all of that? Because if you do that in our system, you would actually have an issue. Like if someone asks what is the next available IP and two systems do that at the same time, there could be a conflict. So what we're doing is when you create the object, you just say, I want one IP from this pool, and you let the system actually figure it out. And it also helps with making sure we're building predictable and idempotent automation. So yeah, that's been I think also a big difference on how we've been approaching that problem in Infrahub.
That's exactly brings me to a question of, okay, so you did a little bit of hand waving there. This is where we're going to get a little bit rough on you. Correct. Netbox, you would have to do, you can call an endpoint and you can get the next available prefix for a certain, pool of IPs and all that good stuff. Now, you've implemented something called the core models. And a lot of the stuff that you talked about there as prefixes appear to be are prefixes part of the core model? And did you find the need to create prefixes, especially because of the allocation issues that you would have around, because just to give the listener an idea, you don't get a lot out of the box with Infrahub, right? You don't even get tags, right? You have to implement tags as your own schema. And, I'll be honest with you, like the nice thing about Netbox is where was the first place I went to when I was trying to design my schema? I went and opened up my Netbox and started to create the things that I know and love, because if I'm going to sync it across, it's going to have to look the same anyway. So you're going to get some inheritance. Like nobody's talking about rebuilding the entire universe from scratch. Well, at least, well, you could this time. So you get the option. But there's a part of the core models that you're offering, and I assume you're going to be offering some more of them over time. But were there specific requirements for the prefix allocation, that sort of thing? Is it a core model? Tell us more.
Yes. So first, actually, it's funny you took the tag because tag is the only model that is provided out of the box, and actually we're discussing about removing it because it's actually an anomaly. It should not be there. But that's the only one that you get. So a few things. You talk about, you get Infrahub, it's completely empty. I think it's been our strength and our weakness probably at the same time. Like there's a lot of people that are like, what the heck is this thing? How do I? So we definitely need to do a better job of helping people get started. So we actually have now what we call the Schema library. So it's a repo on GitHub, but there's a ton of examples on, schema that our guys have already created, customers have already created, the community, and we help them, keep them, make them better and better. So that if you want to start today with Infrahub, you don't have to create your own schema. You can just go on this repo, pick the one that you want, and we probably need to make even more efforts to make all those steps, super, super easy so that people don't have to worry about it at first. But no, it's there. Schema library, Infrahub, there's a lot of really cool stuff. The team that's maintaining that is doing amazing work. Now, you were talking about the IP and the prefix. So what we have embedded is we actually have a generic for a prefix and an IP, but we're not technically providing the schema for the final object that you're going to use, meaning we're using this polymorphism and inheritance concept that you talked about earlier. So that's if you create an object and you say, this is a prefix, then we'll be able to understand and know how it must work in terms of like IP address management and all of that. But technically, you can still create your own schema for the IP or the prefixes. And I think what's really cool is you could have the same as the interface L2, interface L3, and all that. So you could have a partner IP. You could have a customer IP. You could have a lot of things like that, and your customer IP could have a relationship to your customer model, so that you know exactly which IP is used which customer. And your I don't know, like I don't have a ton of example. I think it probably works even better with prefixes. Like you have a model where you have a direct relationship between a prefix and a site, because sometimes you have prefixes that are actually allocated to sites or things like that. So you can have n number of IP, n number of prefixes. You just have to have them inherit from the core construct that we have internally.
And that's, one of those use cases that some ISPs might run into, especially like I've worked with some very interesting Asian carriers where they're using the 1.1.1.1 network for some sort of central ISP, phone termination server. Not that nobody owns the 1.1.1.1 back in 2010, so they just used it, which was great. But what I could, of course, recommend to carriers that are doing some very interesting stuff with the private addresses, they could model both. And again, this is something that might be a limitation inside of Netbox, is you have the VRF definition is hard coded. So this is your virtual routing domain, and the prefixes go into that. And good, have a nice day. Here, you could actually have allocation of, if you have 10 customers, you could give the 1.1, 10.1.1.0, etc. /24s to each of them. And then you could have also a global context. So you can actually model whatever context you need. So let's say that you have a shared service that you're offering as an ISP on the 192.168 1.0 network, like a silly person, and you want all those customers to be able to directly from their prefixes talk to your service. You can actually model both the prefix as a single object, the 10.1.1.0 network that's sitting at that site. You can model it as their virtual routing domain. VRF doesn't come out of the box, so whatever makes sense for you as a virtual routing domain that's on the site, and as a part of the global context. So that allows you to have the same prefix object inside of your database. Now you can do the same thing in Netbox, but you end up with two prefixes, one inside of the global routing domain, and then one inside of the customer's routing domain. But here you can actually start to model all kinds of things. So if you can dream it up, you can do it. So one of the things that we actually, first question I had was, I wanted to start modeling both the fact that we have VPN v4 inside of my core, and we also have Juniper Apster running a EVPN VXLAN fabric. There's no support right now for EVPN VXLAN, and actually being able to bridge those objects together is a nightmare. Like like when you're defining the connection from EVPN VXLAN to good old-fashioned MPLS VPN v4, and this is a network-focused podcast. If you don't know what any of this means, this just means I'm connecting I'm connecting routing addresses inside of the data center to routing addresses inside of the ISP core. So normal, classic ISP stuff. And modeling the connections of those two objects together, that used to just be, well, we're going to need a Postgres database, and we're going to need these fields here, here, and here, and here's the VNI number that comes out of the EVPN VXLAN fabric, and that connects to an import or export target inside of the ISP, the MPLS network. And these could be separate vendors, these could be the same vendors. None of that has anything to do with it. You're always going to end up with some way of connecting a fabric to some sort of internet providing edge. Many ways to do that, of course. But if I'm going to model that inside of Netbox, I start crying immediately, because I either have to break a bunch of objects like the VLAN objects or the interface object or something like that with a lot of custom fields, which I did not want to do. So it was back to the Excel sheet and the Postgres database until now, in which case I can pretty much model the entire EVPN VXLAN and create a connector object that says, hey, this thing connects the BGP, your VPN v4 MPLS, to your EVPN data center core. Yep, no problem. And here's all the related attributes. Wonderful. Do you want to connect that to the firewall directly, or whatever, on the other side of the fabric? You can have the whole chain from my virtual VM center all the way on the right-hand side of the diagram, all the way to the left-hand side is the internet. You can have everything modeled in the path, and that is just incredible power that used to be locked behind Postgres and doing your own custom database. And that's how ISPs and large scale orgs have been solving this for a very long time. But now we get a nice UI inside of Infrahub. We get YAML, and you're doing a lot of work and magic handling the changing of the data. So this kind of brings me up to the thing that might be scaring some people, is creating your own schema and the migration. One of the eye-opening moments was, hey, I'm actually making the change inside of a branch. I'm not changing the main database when I'm messing around with the schema model. So can you tell us a little bit more about, why people shouldn't be scared to play around with the schema files?
Yes. So I think traditionally schema is something that is like at the core of the application and you cannot change it. Or changing it is a very heavy operation that can break everything. In our case, we're actually running the schema in, I would call that the user space, if we call like Linux terminology. And so you can actually have a different schema on every branch. And our recommendation is, if you want to change the schema, just create a branch, change the schema, validate that everything is working properly, and then you can open a proposed change to actually take your change into the main branch, and then we'll apply the migrations that are required when you make the change in your branch, and we'll reapply them when you actually make the change in main. So yeah, I think it's doing everything in a branch. That's the secret. It's like that's the beauty of version control. Like you can just prepare your change, and you're not going to affect the production instance until it's merged and validated.
And that kind of, saves you away from, I personally, I have to run like 3 instances of Netbox. I have my prod, I have my dev, and I have my staging. And this actually would allow me to make changes inside of the branch to the data, get my modeling up, add my custom firewall VDOM object, or whatever I can actually think of. But the first question that comes from the database nerds is, of course, when you used to do this in Postgres, is how do you handle default? So let's say that I have a bunch of firewall objects and I'm adding a new super duper serial field. Do you have like a default value that gets assigned at creation, or does it become null? Like, have you thought about all these angles, of course? And we know that you have.
I mean, this one actually, that would depend when you put it in the schema. If in the schema you define that there's a default value, then we'll automatically assign the default value when we add these fields to all the existing object. If you say that it could be optional, then we'll set it as null. Really, you have the power in the schema to decide that.
And now here's the thing. This is not a friendly podcast. This is where we're going to get really mean on this thing. So for the derived calculated attribute, right, it runs at creation, the async, and I now add I want to add a calculated description field to a bunch of existing objects. Do you handle that out of the box right now? Like, will it recalculate for all my existing things when I merge it into main? Or, how is that going to work? I actually don't know the answer to this one.
I don't know that it's tried that, but yeah, you should. I mean, if you create a computed attribute, it would calculate. Now I want to test that, but yeah, it will recalculate that on all of your object for sure.
We'll have info in the show
notes. That's what it's supposed to do. If that's not what it does, that's the bug.
They'll make it happen, folks. They'll make it happen, because this is the first thing that you think of. Like, there's going to be changes to the schema over time now. Like, you're going to have, with the computer attributes, there's going to be a lot of moving parts in this thing, right? And you want to know that you're in good hands when you're making these schema changes. So the less ambiguity there is about, how you guys view your role as the generator of the particular field, or your role as the curator of the objects. I can tell you, folks listening in the car right now, they do a lot of magic behind the scenes to make sure that your schema migrations and all that are very smooth. Like, you can pretty much throw this into the ChatGPT LLM and have it do a pretty good job out of the box. Like, it's very easy. But the real question is, of course, you have these generated fields. You have all of this capability. You have all of this power. It is very scary, as you said. I found myself going immediately back to Netbox, to the warm, safe, comfortable field that I know, and then starting to copy over the schema object and then starting to model one by one. You have the schema library that people can load up from, that we mentioned before. Now, let's say that we have, and again, this is kind of where you get a lot of power and a lot of responsibility. You want to load up two schemas. You have IP Fabric, but you also have Netbox, and there's some clashing between the models and how you're updating those fields. One of those things that has been happening is I run IP Fabric. I love syncing from it. It's great. I get my devices, I get my route tags and that sort of information all in a calculated uniform format. Really nice multi-vendor, wonderful. But I'm moving these new, let's say, route tags or prefixes or whatever from IP Fabric into my source of truth. I either have the option of automatically updating and just trusting what's live in the network, or I can have some sort of staging area, perhaps another branch that has the information that's coming in, and then I could manually maybe stage those changes. Have you been thinking a little bit about, the if you're drinking the milkshake and sucking up all this data, bringing it into the main branch, any thoughts on that workflow?
Yeah, definitely using a branch, and that will generate a diff. So you will see exactly what are all the changes you're about to bring into main, and then you can, I guess, validate. That would be interesting. I think we have still some work on giving you the ability to delete specific changes from the diff, like so that you say, oh, I don't want this or I don't want that. There's still something there's a bit of work there. But yeah, a branch in the diff is, I think, perfect to validate what comes from those other system you synchronize data with.
So, there's a lot of synchronization. There's a lot of moving parts. You guys are moving really fast. There's a lot of commits on those repos. So, keeping up to date with the latest information is really hard. The Discord channel is, of course, a really nice place to get started for the users. There'll be links in the show notes. I wanted to highlight one of the blogs that you released the other day, how to turn your source of truth into a service factory. This kind of lays out most of the components that are being that we've been talking about, all the way from the custom object. You even have a Streamlit app on top that's interacting with Infrahub, which is a really nice little setup, and that kind of defines the customer resource and the internet gateway. Customer has an internet customer resource, and that has a VLAN, a prefix, and all that thing. And you're tying it all together in that little demonstration blog with the code and the dedicated internet generator class that you're running in the background. So, lots of really good resources available on the site. Anywhere else that people should maybe, if they wanted to know more immediately? I believe I'm trying to set you up with telling them about the lab that you have, the cloud lab.
So yes, we do have there's a public instance you can access, so demo.infrahub.app. There's the documentation, so docs.infrahub.app. And we also have so you can deploy Infrahub easily on using Docker Compose, using Helm charts. One thing to keep in mind is it's still like kind of heavy in terms of resources. So works great on the latest and greatest MacBook, but if you're running a 5 years old Intel laptops, I would not recommend to run Infrahub on it. And then yes, we have those interactive labs that we've been building. So it's a way where you actually get a live instance of Infrahub. You can play with it, but we're also like guiding you through to discover more about the product. And so we're actually building more of those interactive labs. I think it's been pretty cool way to learn.
Exactly. So there's a lot of resources on the site, and of course on the Discord. You have your pretty much the entire staff there, and someone will jump on your question. So what is like? I don't think I'm jumping the shark here, but having been over to the Netbox camp, there's some stuff coming in 4.3, and they're gonna do a similar version of the on top object that points to this resource and that resource. Like you can see that coming a mile away. So you can at least thank Infrahub. You're really driving change inside of our beloved existing products. So when I heard about that, I was like, cool. So that means that I'll be able to model my on top service that points to the prefix, the VLAN, and that'll exist on top. But of course, yeah, there are some, again, love Netbox, but like the branching plugin, it kind of doesn't work right now. And they'll fix it, give them time. You can stay on version 4.1 of Netbox forever right now and just be happy. You'll just be happy. You'll go to work. Your kids will go to school. Everyone's good, right? But is a difference between the new stack that is, again, I always come back to it. You can search for emojis inside of Infrahub, dude. Like you can search for emojis. Icelandic letters get turned into spaces, like inside a Netbox. It's troublesome, and there have been some meetings that I did not want to have because of those issues. But again, newer stack, you have the graph database, you have the GraphQL, built in that's not on top of the Postgres, so it's actually faster and kind of works. Anything else you want to highlight to the user? If they want to make the jump from their existing IPAM DCIM solution to Infrahub.
I think we covered a lot of things. Yeah, there's probably more to say about the services, but I don't know if we have time to go into that. Yeah, join Discord. If you have any questions, please. I think we're really trying to work with the community. If there's anything you don't like about Infrahub, and I'm sure there's some of it. It's still a fairly early tool. Like, please let us know. Actually, we'd love to hear. Even more than what you like, we want to hear what you don't like so that we can fix it. And, I think we've been really good at listening to the community and trying to move fast. Actually, there's something that people have been complaining about for a long time. That was that we don't have the equivalent of the device template, the device type that you have in Netbox. So that's actually coming in the next couple of weeks. Might even be out by the time the podcast gets published. So, as you say, I think we're trying to move fast and work with the community. Love the community. So please join us and let us know what we need to fix.
They're definitely working fast, and they're very quick to respond to issues, especially on the GitHub and that sort of thing. The one thing that I forgot to highlight is that we talked a lot about that artifact into generation. It is actually, it can appear as a separate tab on that object. So, if you go to demo.infrahub.app, go over to devices, click on one of the devices, and you'll see a separate tab on the object called artifacts. And there you will have a very interesting area to play with and have a look at. Urs, what you got for me, buddy?
Yeah, definitely impressing how fast they're moving. I remember when I was working with the first demo, and now the UI. For me, it's also really impressive how they can generate from any schema a UI. That's definitely not an easy task. One thing we did not really talk about, I think, was the generators. So we were talking about the abstraction on the, let's call it northbound side to get the artifacts. But they also, when we would look at the blog post about the service catalog, with the generators, there is some really nice use case I'm seeing there. So there is so many things. I think we would have many podcasts to cover all the parts. Yeah,
it's starting to sound like we're going to have a part 2 coming up at some point. I'm hoping to get one of your lovely people over here, and we can always talk to the founder, but it's also interesting to talk to some of the users.
You should definitely talk to the team. There's some amazing guys. We have what we call the customer success team, and like Baptiste, who wrote the blog. There's Wim, Benoit, there's Alex, there's Michael. They're all amazing. They're all really good at automating networks. They have a lot of experience. So yeah, you should definitely bring them on the show.
Yeah, so
it'll be fun.
Let's see if we're still on by that time or if we're all sitting in jail. So with that, we're coming up on the top of the hour, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this episode. And we've already plugged Damien, and we've plugged OpsMill. There'll be lots of links in the show notes for people who want to follow up on this. In conclusion, we really don't know how to end these podcasts, so usually we just cut to black now. And thank you so much for coming on the show, Damien.
Thank you for having me. It was fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Last but not least, our favorite part of the show. We're going to need a controversial take. Damien, what's your most controversial take that you want to leave with our listeners?
So we already said that I love Ansible. I think that could have been somewhat of a controversial take. But my next one, I think probably even more controversial, is I think XML is awesome. I hear so many people hating XML. I started my days in Junos, and I think actually that was really cool. I have a special love for XML. So, come and beat me. I'll probably make a T-shirt so that
Dude,
you
you're
can
gonna
find
get
me.
beat up at conferences talking like that. Now, listen, I
I
know
think
you.
with the right tooling at Juniper, actually working on XML on Junos, it's awesome.
You
Jeremy Schulman, he built a lot of really cool tools, and we had a lot of great tooling. I think that was really cool.
So just for the listener in the car, you can't put comments inside of JSON, and you can't put the descriptors and all that. And XML does have some advantages, but it does look like when you're trying to bleep. It does look like bleep when you're trying to view it on day to day, and that's why we created yet another markup language, YAML, which gets then replaced by TOML, and this is it's never ending. We're always going to have a new markup language every single week. But all right, he's an XML lumber. Add that to your LinkedIn status and stick it in your pipe and smoke it. In conclusion, thank you for listening.